Okay. Well, good afternoon, everyone. I just very pleased to have been able to bring John Given here. I first heard a version of this talk about at a conference probably about a year ago now, and at the time I thought this would be really something I'd like to bring to Queens because it's a very interesting presentation, and it's both quite striking and also has quite a lot of really conceptual content to it as well when you start to mine it a bit. So
on a good day, Bob.
On a good day. Well, I think hope you're going to have a good day. I think also it has a good because it is based upon John's own sort of background from Donegal. It does definitely have a definite sort of Irish dimension to it, but it also has quite a sociological dimension to it as well. I think I'll just sort of turn over to John now and just say that this is it's called has several titles, but the one title I've been using is the here and there of things, and we'll perhaps have another one on the board. So I'll turn over to John.
Okay. Good afternoon, everybody. Yeah, there are two parts. I'll explain what's going to happen. There are two parts really. I'm going to quickly run through some of the theoretical background, and that's this first little presentation, which I'll compress to about 20 minutes, and that's called the narrative construction and performance of identity, as you can see. And then the second part will be showing a project, which is largely an audio-visual project, and that's called the here and there of things, and that is largely autobiographical and deals with the issue of coming from a family which were from Donegal, but which settled in the UK in the 1930s. So I was the first Englishman in an Irish family, so it deals with that kind of dimension. So there's two distinct parts. In this part, I'm going to talk about three main ideas, really. I'm going to talk about the importance of language in the evolution of humanity. I'm going to talk about identity from what I call a narrative perspective, or my particular take on what I mean by the narrative construction and performance of identity. And then I want to briefly touch on the impact of globalization on traditional senses of identity, the impact of globalization on traditional identities. So those are the three themes I'm going to try and cover in the first 20 minutes or so. It will be a bit compressed because each of those themes merits quite a lot more time than I'm about to give it. But I should say a little bit about how I came to this interest. When I first started working at Northumbria University, which was there were large reptiles roaming the earth at that time. It was about 30 odd years ago, and I was doing action research on sort of what were then euphemistically called difficult to let estates. In other words, the kind of rough estates around Townside. And we had a kind of advice shop on the estates, and we used that as a base for dispensing housing advice and activating pressure groups and such like. And I then became very interested in the stories that were told about the place. And I moved on, and how that affected policy about the place. I sat in a meeting very early in my career with the Director of Housing and Social Services and Chief of Police and so on. And at one point, the Director of Housing was discussing a particular estate. He just said in the middle of this meeting, well, we all know what the problem is. That was a model estate, and those animals have wrecked it. And that was just the way he put it. And I was quite staggered that he was felt free to say this in that kind of sort of meeting. And so we then ran with the animal theory for a bit of time. But it was the power. I realized talking to people, whenever you said to any of the local authority officers, they would say to you, "What are you doing here?" Because in those days I had hair and things, so that they would say to you, "What are you doing here?" And I said, "I'm working on the Dean's estate," and they would take a kind of step back, and then they would regale you with horror stories about the Dean's estate. So I realized that the only way this officer class talked about this place was a brisk trade in horror stories, and it was competitive. Who had the worst story about the place? And that was the context within which policy was formed. So it was an early introduction to the idea that there was power in stories that was more than just anecdotal. And I then became interested in the idea of urban myths, but quickly moved on, which is where I met Bob, to a more formal consideration of narrative theory and method. And that's what I'm going to quickly talk about now. Hopefully the technology will enable us to see what I would like to show you. I should say, when I started working on the Dean's estate, I did an early interview with a guy who was, from my point of view, perfect. He was an original resident on the estate, which had been built in 1932. and he was an ex-miner, so he'd always lived there, so my point of view was great. He'd been there at the start, and we were able to nail the myth of the model estate by talking to people like him. Anyway, there were a couple of problems with the interview. I was recording it, but in those days I had a nice miniature tape recorder which was the size of a small nuclear device now, it's about this big. And I was recording it, and there were a couple of problems with the interview. One was that the miner was quite deaf, so I had to shout my questions. The other was he had a very bad cough from working in the pits. And the killer problem was he had a parrot, and the parrot was in the habit of squawking whenever the miner talked. So when I got home and played the tape back, I was apparently interrogating a parrot with a nasty cough. I always wish I'd kept the tape, because it would have been a good example of the perils of technology. However, we'll just proceed. I'd like you to tell me what you think this image is. Just quickly shout out anything. First thing that comes into your mind. A fossil. A landscape. Stone Age painting. A brain. Anything else? An ashtray. Any more? Footprint. I could improvise a badge or something at the end. Okay. Anybody recognise this? Anybody been to Australia? This is a detail from Ayers Rock, or Uluru. And here's the thing, what's in the name? The naming of things. And what you were looking at, of course, was this, where's the thing? This rock feature here. But in Aboriginal belief, in the Aboriginal belief system, in the Aboriginal belief system, this, the understanding of this feature really was that here's the skull of an ancestor creature. Here's the back, and there's the tail. You can see the tail, perhaps. So they are in Aboriginal belief system, in the dream time, the time of creation, when the world was being created, this ancestor creature, after a battle with another one, leant against the rock, exhausted. And that's the mark that the ancestor creature left on the rock. And it leads me to thinking, or it led me to thinking about, or I'm using this rather to illustrate something about evolution and evolution of humanity, and thinking about Australian Aboriginals and hunter-gatherers in general. Because in evolutionary terms, for 99.9% of Homo sapiens evolution, they were hunter-gatherers. No written transmission of culture. All culture was passed on in an oral and performative way. Dance, music, ritual, cave paintings obviously, but no other form of transmission, an oral and performative way. And this leads us on to thinking about what was distinctive about our species of ape as opposed to any other, and it leads into a discussion and argument about when did the species acquire language. Because the argument is, or my argument is, that language is symbolic language is the distinguishing feature of our species as opposed to any other. And I'm not going to go into qualifications here about whales singing and so on. All species have forms of communicative language, if you like. But by symbolic language, I mean the power of language to convey multiple and often contradictory meanings. And particularly, obviously, language using tense, future tense, past tense, present, means that we can live imaginatively in the future and we can recapture the past. And this represents human culture. This represents the historic birth of human culture. So when the species acquired language is a kind of fascinating, if complicated and infuriating debate, about which there's lots of interesting stuff going on in relation to DNA, that kind of, what do you call it, not psychoanthropology, it's another name for it, but that kind of mixture of neuroscience and anthropology is starting to throw up some interesting questions. But there is a kind of general consensus, as far as I can make out, that the species had probably acquired language about 250,000 years ago. The earliest kind of art impressions, I think, are dated. There's a kind of inscribed stone from the Bloembos cave in South Africa, which is dated at about 72,000 years, something like that. But that's the earliest artifact. So the rest of it is sort of speculative or theoretical. But there is an agreement, looking at stone tool technology and such like that, probably by certainly by 100,000 years ago, and probably 250,000 years ago, the species had acquired symbolic language. And by symbolic language, I mean the ability of language to convey multiple meanings. This is the ghost of the parrot entering at this point. You should be seeing an animation, which isn't, and parrot still flapping his wings. Okay. There are different explanations, of course, about the origin of language, and it's worth just thinking for a moment about how much of our identity is tied up in language. Obviously, this is one explanation for a religious explanation for the multiplicity of languages. I mean, I think there's still something like 7,000 extant languages. Those sort of, a lot of those are disappearing fast. But if you just consider for a moment the idea of the amount of identity that's tied up with accent, never mind different languages, just accent, and how quickly we attach an identity to somebody as soon as they open their mouth. A friend of mine from Australia points out that, well, the trouble with you Brits, she would say, is that as soon as you open your mouth, you get put in a box by class, by region, by education, and so on. You know, these gradations of accent allow people to project a narrative onto you very, very quickly. Whereas, for instance, the argument was in Australia, that's largely not the case. You might be able to tell that people come from a city or a country, but you wouldn't be able to regionalise them by accent because it's a relatively recent and highly immigrant sort of population. So, just to summarise quickly, I'm arguing that the development of symbolic language systems has been fundamental in the development of Homo sapiens. And thinking about the Aboriginals, that when we looked at that first image, what you were doing was projecting meaning onto it. And you projected multiple meanings onto it. Because that's what we do as human beings. We project meanings onto things. And if you think about the hunter-gatherers, the Australian Aboriginals, they lived in a landscape where everything was storied, everything had meaning, every aspect of the landscape was tied into a creation myth. You probably, some of you come across, the controversy around Bruce Chapman's book Songlines, the idea of songlines that, the people, as they progressed through their kind of hunting grounds, their traditional territories, every place they came to was storied. And they would rehearse the stories of the place when they were in the place. And this would be called singing the land. It would bring the land back to life. And interestingly, concepts of time in over 200 Aboriginal languages, there's no concept of linear time. All their discussion of time is cyclical. So it's a completely different kind of conception about things like time in traditional Aboriginal cultures, anyway, as far as I can gather. The point being that they existed in a narrative landscape. Every part of the landscape, every animal, every tree was understood in the mythological context. Well, we would describe it as mythological, from being outside that tradition, but it had meaning. So it's the idea really, and the central idea I'm trying to convey in this first part is the idea of a narrative landscape. That humanity developed as human in a storied landscape. It was the storying of the world through which humanity became what it is. And that for the overwhelming part of our existence, that's been the case. All knowledge transmitted in an oral and performative way. And the kind of possibly step too far in the argument is that that's how our brains are actually configured. This is where we step into the kind of dodgy world of neuroscience. And there's an interesting, very interesting interface now, I think, developing between what the neuroscientists are doing with their advanced scanning techniques when they're looking at, for instance, this kind of gesture here, because there's an argument about the evolution of language which suggests that it was largely to do with tool making and the use of the thumb and opposable fingers, and you can't go into this, it's too detailed, but when we make these signs, it's interesting how we do make gestures as we talk, because the same parts of the brains light up when I'm using these gestures as light up with language behavior, so the two are very closely related. And it gives you a hint about how language evolved. But that's a dangerous topic for me, because I kind of go on a lot about different theories about evolution of language, because it is really very interesting. And I'm just stopping myself talking about language and music and song, so I won't go down there, but it's a very interesting idea. So the idea of that, and when people talk about this idea about the evolution of language, there's also quite a fierce debate about, the timing of it is important, because there are lots of people who will argue that there was a fundamental kind of, not rewiring of the brain, but something happened. There was a kind of symbolic explosion. And this is, a lot of people who talk about the distribution of artifacts and cave art and so on is all dated back to this period, where some people talk about Big Bang, the kind of evolutionary Big Bang, cultural evolutionary Big Bang. And it seems to be something happened where there's a different level of consciousness evolved, probably about 200,000 years ago, and it was to do with the acquisition of symbolic language. Now that's all highly theoretical and debatable, but it's interesting. And I'm arguing really that it is what we are storytelling animals, and that this is, if not hardwired into the brain, then the brain has evolved to see the world in a narrative way. And therefore this is a kind of biopsychosocial theory, if you like. And I think it corresponds with a lot of thinking in different parts of contemporary sociology, which take an interest in embodiment and the idea that we are embodied creatures. And a lot of classical sociological theory sort of disregards the body. I mean, obviously in feminist theory and gay theory and so on, it's become much more mainstream. But you get up in the morning, you look in the mirror, you have to deal with it. Part of what you are is the body. And I think thinking about that evolutionary perspective and the way in which our senses have evolved, I mean, there's a talk of 6 or 10 million years of evolution of the hominid species, the apes, 6 or 10 million years. And if you're talking about evolution of the senses, you're going much, much further back. Now, the reason I'm talking about this is that although our consciousness is shaped by language, I'm going to go on to argue, language deals and decodes with all the sensory inputs, and these are embodied. We inhabit a world of the senses, and this is often under-theorized in sociology, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that quite soon. So the issue is, our brains are the same as those brains we've just been talking about, the people who made the cave art. We don't seem to have evolved much beyond that, according to Picasso and people. So the issue is, what kind of narrative landscapes do we inhabit? Question for contemporary sociologists, anthropologists. How are these being shaped or reshaped by contemporary processes of globalization? And how are personal and community identities being formed and reformed in these contemporary and digital landscapes? So I want to talk about two ideas here. And this is Daniel Dennett's idea, the idea of the self as a center of narrative gravity, which I think is quite a nice suggestive idea in line with this. I'm not going to go into a lot of details. Where Dennett is an interesting guy. He's an American philosopher who is interested in neuroscience. So he grounds a lot of his kind of metaphors of how consciousness works and how identity is created in the dialogue between sort of philosophical ideas and what's happening in the contemporary world of neuroscience. Now he talks about memes, which are a highly controversial idea, and I am interested in a loose kind of interpretation of what we mean by mimetic patterns, the idea that stories, and jokes and adverts and so on, all those irritating tunes that you actually hate but you can't get out your mind, lodge in your mind, and they run round all the time. To me, that's what I'm thinking of when I'm thinking about a meme. Dennett describes the self, therefore, as an extended phenotype. I don't know if people are familiar with those terms. The best example, I think, is the idea of a spider and the spider's web. That's the extended phenotype, is the web, which brings you to thinking about Max Weber's idea about, what's his famous quote, that we are animals suspended in webs of significance which we ourselves have spun. So it kind of maps onto that idea of the extended phenotype. You can't imagine the spider in the absence of the web. The spider needs the web. Humans need language to communicate and to create meaning. So this idea, first of all, of the self as a center of narrative gravity. Oops, what am I doing? The wrong thing. Go away. And then there's another metaphor he used which I really like, and this is where Dennett talks about the neuroscience aspect of things. And his description of this, he says, looking at the kind of what they're looking at in the brain scanners in neuroscience, is that all the sensory inputs to the body, all the sensory inputs in the brain are rendered into language to make meaning. And the way that this is done is that he talks about the conscious mind consisting of, he talks about a tumult of specialist neurocomputational agents performing limited tasks with limited access to information. In other words, the part of the brain that deals with sound, that lights up, or smell. So when you smell something which is highly evocative of memory, which it often is, isn't it? A smell evokes kind of often a very powerful memory. That all of these sensory inputs, depending on the context, the mind makes sense of them by translating these sensory inputs into some kind of narrative. What's the story? You're trying to make sense. We're constantly trying to make sense of the situation. Like, what does that smell remind me of? What is that noise? What's going on? Is that the cat knocked something over downstairs, or is that a burglar? We're constantly attaching meaning to the sensory inputs. And this idea of the Joseon machine is Dennett's metaphor to describe what's going on, that we're bombarded with a mass of sensory inputs, and we're constantly running a series of conversations with ourselves. You kind of know this intuitively. You might be here trying to pay attention to what I'm on about. You might also be thinking about what you're going to have for dinner tonight, or what happened last night. And this is the way we are. We're constantly running these stories around. And this is what he means by the Joseon machine. And this is an issue, of course, for standard social science research, when you're asking people questions and getting answers. I mean, you're getting a version of events, and we're very good at producing stories, aren't we? We do it like that. It's an incredible skill. I mean, you have one version of what happened last night for the policeman, another for your mother, another for your best friend, and so on. And you sort of produce versions like that. Well, I mean, I do anyway, but, that's what we're very good at. And I think it's quite an interesting idea, this idea of the Joseon machine, that we're constantly running versions of stories or versions of events, and we're constantly rehearsing what might be. Certainly, you walk away from a situation, you say, 2 or 3 minutes later, I know what I should have said to that. So I should have said, And then, like a day or two later, in telling the story, it's probably what you did say. What you should have said becomes, what you did say. And that's the way we do things. That's the way people are. So that's that idea of the Joseon machine. So I like those two metaphors, really. The idea of the self as a center of narrative gravity, and the mind working like a kind of Joseon machine. I was going to bring some poetry into your life, but we're going to skip that because of time, I want to talk about this idea of breaking down the self as a center of narrative gravity into thinking about ways in which you can break that down a bit. So you can think about the body as a center of narrative gravity, or you could think about place as a center of narrative gravity, or time. But of course, all three are always present. You are embodied, you're in a place, and it's at a certain time. And all these are the elements that construct the narrative. So this is a nice little quote from Becker, really, accompanied by a picture of John Martin from Duckraban in County Donegal. We carry a history with us into the present through our bodies. The past is sedimented in the body, that it is embodied. It's something I meant to say when I was talking about the Aboriginals, that idea that, there's 30,000, first settlement in the first occupation of Australia is dated at about 50,000 years ago. I think the earliest finds are 50,000 down in south of Australia there. So presumably, since they came over the New Guinea routes, it would be earlier. Those tribes were inhabiting that landscape relatively uninterruptedly, looking at the DNA evidence, relatively no other sort of waves of invasion for sort of, 40, 50,000 years. And so the stories which are sedimented into the landscape are of that sort of antiquity. And it's that idea of sedimentation of story in language and landscape, which is a really interesting one, I think, to keep hold of in that context, and to reflect on our own, what constitutes a tradition or history in a European context. or in a local context even, you know, the sedimentation of stories. So you could pursue a whole research agenda which is to do with bodies, and I'm quite interested in that, the impact of globalization on the body, and I'm aware that I'm really already spending too much time on the theory side of things, but there's a lot of interesting things there about the way in which we think about our bodies. If you take, for instance, the impact of developments in medical science and you know, technical innovations to do with the body, this concept of posthumanism already moving into a kind of post-human era. I've got an artificial hip. They're saying already that a child has been born who will live to be over 300 years old. It's this idea of escape velocity, that, you know, the advance in medical sciences and technology is now so rapid that, you know, you put your stem cells in the fridge and you just kind of nip them out and grow the relevant bit that's dropped off, and the steady replacements, you know, replacement surgery and so on, that the advance in medical science has kind of overtaken mortality, if you like, so that, you know, those advances are moving away and mortality is being pulled up behind it. For those who can afford it, of course, which raises some interesting problems about, you know, who's going to be able to access this kind of technology, which will enhance your life. I mean, it's already here, isn't it, with the idea of you know, implanting chips in people one way or another, and smart drugs and so on. Changes. So the impact of globalization on our sense of mortality itself, what it is to be human. You know, it used to be people got sick and died, and, you know, they said prayers and that was that. Now there's an expectation you get sick and you should be cured. You know, things should be made right. So there's that whole thing about the body. I'm going to start skipping through things now, because I think I've put across the sort of main theoretical ideas that I wanted to, or at least I hope I have. Obviously, place. It's a nice quote from Carruthers there about local knowledge. One knows intimately a local history, a social and psychic geography with its fault lines and upthrusts, just as one knows a landscape through which one moves daily. Such knowledge is particular and narrative in nature. It is just like, indeed it often is, gossip. Local knowledge. And again, you know, it's the stories which people are willing to share with you. And again, there are implications here for how people go about social research. What stories will be told to who and under what conditions. This is a rather longer quote about place, and I'm going to skip over that one. So my argument really is that these local landscapes of identity are being shaped and sculpted by the combined flows of power, money, technology and information. I mean, that's what I mean by globalization, the idea of a global landscape, a narrative landscape, which is being reshaped by these kind of flows, these simultaneous flows of power, money, technology and information. Some of these flows are hot and fast in some parts of the world, like the Pearl River Delta, Shanghai, these mega cities. The landscape is being, you know, radically transformed, and the kind of narratives through which people understand the world and themselves are equally rapidly being changed by that. So that's what I mean by globalization, really. And we're interested really in the local impact of these flows. I'm going to skip through some of these quotes. So people are trapped in history, history's trapped in people. And the extent to which people can integrate these various stories about body, place and time is the extent to which people can be said to have a traditional identity, or even a coherent identity narrative. And the extent to which these things are disintegrated, people lose a sense of themselves in relation to their body, or in relation to place, or in relation to time. When these things are disjointed or disrupted, and this becomes an issue about identity. And there's a lot of talk, of course, in sociology about patchwork identities, saturated selves, fragmented selves, liquid identities, and so on. I think they're all referring to this situation of fragmented narratives. You can think about this at all these different levels: individual, family, community, and so on, political and religious narratives. And I'm skipping through these because I really want to probably just stop with this, really. Sartre's quote, "Man is always a teller of stories. He lives surrounded by his own stories and those of other people. He sees everything that happens to him in terms of these stories, and he tries to live his life as if he were recounting it." So I'm interested really in the impact of contemporary technologies, so on how we organize a sense of ourselves through stories. So if you could think of technologies of memory, for instance, used to have the family album with the kind of photographs in. Now, of course, with digital technologies, there's a kind of deluge of information, isn't there? A deluge of kind of, got the frightening idea that your mother's probably got a video of your first moments of birth, somewhere tucked away under her bed, which you're going to be confronted with at some awful moment, And everybody's life is kind of stored digitally in some form or other. And what effect does this have on people's sense of self and so on? It's just an interesting speculation. Okay, that's the angel of history, and that's the end of this theory production. So I'm just going to quickly switch over to show you a project which is sort of based on these ideas, although you might think it's kind of quite a long way away from them. But those are the sort of theoretical ideas really that I'm quite interested in. The idea of a narrative landscape, and I think that's, from the point of view, when I was sitting with the miner in the Dean's estate, and subsequently I now think of domestic interiors as a narrative landscape. The stories which are there in a domestic interior, the ornaments which sit on everybody's mantelpiece, which are embedded with narrative. They're meaningful, but they're often overlooked. But that's people's sense of self is embedded in their kind of immediate space that they occupy, and that's often a domestic space. That's why burglaries are so devastating when what's lost are the kind of family objects, sentimental objects, more so than objects maybe of just material value, because what's gone is that whole performance of identity in relation to the object. So I'm just going to quickly put in another thing here, and I can probably take some questions on the wing if while I'm doing this.
Somehow the way that memory works, just before the words come to fix us in one story on Kinloch, Rush, Duncairn, Shannon, Carnival, Balala, Julie, Jubilee, Cornwall, Hello, Drain, Cloudy. These are names of townlands in Bengal, names that were scattered about in the stories that washed over me as I grew up, an English-born boy in an Irish family. Stories about birth, death, sickness and marriage. And stories about land. Who had it to be? Who had bought, sold, rented or stolen it? And who had lost, stolen, cheated out of it. The names of those who found the poetry and the mystery of their own became passwords